Hello, and welcome to another episode of Around the Verse, our weekly look at Star Citizen's ongoing development. I'm Sandy Gardiner.
And I'm Forrest Stephan.
Tomorrow is CitizenCon 2947, our annual celebration of all things Star Citizen, where we shine the spotlight on a lot of interesting content. But we've also got plenty of eye candy to show you today. This episode features part 2 of our look at the changes and improvements coming to the game's legacy armor.
But before that, let's take a look at what bugs and blockers the development team conquered this week in
Burndown.
Welcome back to Burndown, our weekly show dedicated to reviewing progress on the release of Star Citizen Alpha 3.0. Last week, we were at 20 remaining must-fix issues to close down our next game loop of shopping, cargo, and commodity trading. Let's jump right in and see how the team's progressing.
Well, the absolute priorities for this week, as usually, is keep the build stable, be able to add more feature work to it. We still have like a bunch of features we want to closing out, but the priority is obviously get the shopping loop nice and still keep the things which are running well at the moment, like keep the optimization, keep the performance good, keep the stability, and have the things we already have in, like mainly the quantum travel and the traversal between the planets and everything, still working in a functional state.
Bad news for this morning was that QA have flagged 100% server crash, which George is actually looking into, so he's doing that for the next hour and a bit, but hopefully looks to get a fix within the next hour or so anyway.
George is currently working on an optimization in the network code. A lot of this has already gone in but had to be split up because it's such a big change into a lot of different change lists. Many of these have gone in and have settled and been fine, but now that we're getting to the later ones, some of them are causing some issues. So if one goes in and causes some issues in a build, it just means we yank it back out, fix it, chuck it back in, see if that works. This is something that we've got to do with network changes because they're quite big changes to happen, and it's all happening in the background as well, so it's not something that's easily visual to testers. But what we'll do is keep doing that until stuff settles and fits properly, and then we can get the rest of it in, and once all of those parts are in, then we'll start seeing the difference from an optimization point of view.
There's also the other disconnect, which I believe is the one that you were talking about, 3007, and I believe that one is being looked at still by Chad McKinney.
Well, can we get like an update on why it's taking so long to get these things fixed? Because we've been seeing about this level now for a while, and if they're spread properly and it's like one person looking at it, that means that like one person's been looking at a bug for 2 weeks.
That bug is like very hard to reproduce. It's like random, and people, basically how people work on it is right now they look at the logic of the code and they try to guess what's happening, and then they do fix for that, and then obviously it doesn't work, and it's just super hard to reproduce, so we might need QA to help them somehow, like connect to the local service or whatever. Yeah, it's just a hard issue to fix.
That was the error disconnect 3007. So that's one of the more common ones. It was Chad that put the final fix in, but it was due to the information that Clive's team was able to get for him.
So right now I'm looking at a disconnect that happens for clients when joining a server. And it's a disconnect that happens because the zone host for a spawning entity cannot be found on the client. The root of the issue is because of something called the ownership hierarchy for this entity. Ownership is a way that we can establish some parent and child relationship that requires both the entities in question to be present. So the change that I put in was to enforce on item port attaching and detaching that the zone host was always correctly established for the entities in question. Unfortunately, it didn't quite fix the problem, and so right now I'm trying to figure out what the situation is where this still is not enough. However, I think we're close to solving this for Avocati, and I look forward to killing this bug off because it's been lying around on several engineers for like 3 weeks now.
Along with the fixes network has been doing, we've had the code team over in Germany have been debugging a lot of the code, the data that's been coming back from the Ivocati. And Christopher Bolt has actually got a list of all the worst offenders put together now. They have put them all into our bugging system and are working through getting those sorted as well. So the coming build should have improved performance because the information they got back was really good for them. They were able to get a lot of useful information there.
And then one major focus was networking thread, which we were bound. Networking cost was part multi-threaded, part optimized. Really soon another large optimization is going on to parallelize even more of the network thread to help us with performance, that we should be no longer network bound in a 24 player plus situation, which leave us to two other things which basically bound our performance. As most of the Ivocati have seen, we have already many characters on the space stations. They have a cost to update. And so basically one of the focuses is to optimize the update for characters. One thing we already did is one of the components which is related to it. We optimized this one. Another one was parallelized. Besides this, we did some low-level optimizations to the area systems because the areas are used by the AI code, but areas are a more general system. And before we kept an octree to do culling against the areas for each of these areas, which wasn't really necessary because we don't use many of these areas for actually spatial searches. This is now fixed. We only keep this octree updated for areas where we're actually going to search against. On a really full server, I think the values 4 weeks ago, the worst server captures I could see were around 200 millisecond frames and more, which roughly is 5 FPS. Now we are around 80 to 90 millisecond frames, which is 12 to 15. It's a large improvement on one side, on the other side it's still not 30. So we are going to continue to look into this.
Yeah. Well, I would say like for the Ivocati, we need to kind of define which kind of fixes we would need to only test in Ivocati. So off the top of my head, we have performance improvements, and then we have server crash fixes.
I agree with Justin's point that the whole purpose of the Ivocati is to test performance and server crash or performance issues and stability, right? So do we feel like these two server crashes are worth a build?
Well, it's also to test feedback as well. I do want to just verify that point, but primarily I'd say that the server crashes and network instability is the key focus, but it is to also get that kind of feedback on the features as well.
Well, yeah, but obviously if we don't have new features...
Yes, no, totally.
But I think at the moment we also want to kind of push for the WAF builds, right? So that needs to be tested as well, I guess.
When we looked at it with Paul and Todd and the guys today, what we feel like we need to do is actually just have these major 3 categories, and that is the cargo system as a whole, commodities and the shopping actual of those commodities and purchasing of those, and then the shopping of concentrating on physical items and the actual shop polish. If you split them into those categories, then at least we've got the teams focused on those specific sprints. The idea though is also with the gameplay review that we have and this little stand-ups that we're going to do 10 to 15 minutes per day, they talk about all 3 of those sprints, the ones that I've just pasted in the chat. And then on top of it, what we have is those sprints still being active by the relevant members and owners of that. So what it will be is we'll have those 3 sprints in this schedule, and it means that we have to very quickly today retrofit the existing ones that may not be appropriate to what we've got currently, and then get the dates adjusted. We're going to stick around tonight, Todd, Paul, to be able to have that conversation with Jake straight away, and then with Mark White, and then we get that adjusted, and then I think that that's the way that you know exactly what you want for that cargo, commodity, shopping for physical shops loop all the way around.
The next worst issue is a return of no shops or commodities in the kiosks in Stanton. They don't have any items. So this is an issue Ivocati had last week, then it was fixed, and now it's back.
Well, I'm guessing that if it happened like a few days ago, and it's happened again, it's probably going to be the same issue. So whoever fixed it last time, can't they just look at it and say, oh yeah, it's this, and fix it again?
Yeah, it's currently It's currently with Spencer. It was him that fixed it last time, so it'll be it went straight to him, I believe.
Well,
it's then moved to Pete.
It's now
with Pete McKay. So Pete McKay has it now. It may be a data issue. Spencer's already looked into it. The issue that he thought it was last time seems to not be the case this time. So there's something else going on.
So today we saw once again that there were no items in the shops or in the kiosks in our shipping build. But this is not, it is a new bug, but it's the same symptoms. We see this popping up a lot, and it's a different reason every time, where it's just, oh no, today in our shipping build there's no items in the shops. And it's a good example of how a change that's totally unrelated to shops could cause this issue. So what happened was there was an edit to our JSON parser in Diffusion, which would change the serialization from regular floating point numbers to doubles, increasing the precision of our fractional numbers. And what this did was the message that we got from the shopping service for all the inventory, for all the shops, instead of sending us integers that was expected, it started sending us doubles or floating point numbers. And so those numbers were not integers, so the shop didn't know what to do with them. So it said, oh, every item just has a stock and a price and a buying price of 0. And if there's 0 stock, the shop doesn't spawn any of these items on the racks. So even though every shop knew about the correct inventory, none of them got spawned. So totally unrelated change in the JSON parser, just broke all shops.
One of the bugs I worked on today had to do with the image being oversized in the list. So as you can see, as you scroll down the list, the image will become oversized as new items come into view. And the issue is that because our list is pooled, meaning that as you scroll down, the same number of items on screen remains the same. It doesn't overflow. So what it basically reuses the display object from the top and shifts that down to the bottom as you scroll. So what we needed to do was to just basically reset the dimensions of the image each time new data has been injected to that display object. And so, yeah, and we fixed that. It was pretty easy, pretty straightforward.
Yesterday I submitted the first part of the commodity kiosk, like ship status bit field, so that they could, in the UI, track if the ship's destroyed or at the same location, or if it doesn't hold cargo at all. And there was one other that I don't remember. Oh, if insurance is currently being claimed on it such that it couldn't be used. So Simon will take these and use them so they could gray out things in the commodity kiosk, like ships that you can't select at that time.
And the bug we're talking about is that airlock suddenly didn't work anymore. Reason for that was, so you could still approach the airlock, go to the panel and see an interaction. The thing was, the localization string for that airlock was missing, because in the initial setup we used an interaction string from Squadron 42, but that gets not put into shipping builds, which means it works fine in editor, it works fine in our internal testing, but once it gets to shipping builds, to a 3.0 or to Evocati, it doesn't work anymore. It took us a moment to track that down, but it was basically an easy fix, just adding a new localization string. But yeah, in the first moment everyone panicked a bit, it's like, why is this not working? It should. But yeah, inner thought essentially ignores interactions which have no localization string attached to them.
So we've been focusing on closing out cargo, commodities, and physical shopping. Last night we did a review of physical shopping, called out some new issues that will need to get fixed. Then from there, we had done previous reviews of cargo as well as the commodities. The guys have been working through that, and it's almost ready for director review, so I will be reviewing that ideally either tomorrow or on Monday, and then those things should be good to go. Obviously, I try to play the game every single day. We're constantly looking at the game loops. So for us, it's flying, doing missions, going, spending that money that you've just earned, and then upgrading your ship, upgrading your own personal armor, weapons, so on and so forth. So that's really what we've been focusing on. The missions I think are in a very good spot. And then now it's getting shopping and getting that to feel right. And with the missions, we'll go through and we'll do some final tweaks, but the UI is there, and then it's making sure that item 2.0 and the ships and the way that those things feel is right. So everything's starting to close down, and we're getting to a point where we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
We've made solid forward momentum on many areas this week, including improved load times and performance. We've fixed numerous disconnection issues and completed several items for purchasing and utilizing inventory. At the time of filming this, we are at 16 issues, which has been identified as 3 blockers, 7 criticals, 3 highs, and 3 moderates. Now next week, we'll have a revised production report that highlights the remaining features that need completing before we push to a wider PTU and then full live release. So come back and check that out here on Burndown.
Our production schedule report is updated every single week, so head to our website for a more detailed look at all of our ongoing work.
And last week, in part 1 of our feature, we showed off some of the changes coming to the Legacy Outlaw armor. In part 2, we explore the improvements to the Marine armor set.
This redesign was essential to make the Marine armor more modular and work with the updated Mel base body. These changes also allowed the character team to bring the Marine armor in line with our current standards.
Let's take a look at the second part of our feature on Legacy armor.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah Lee, Senior Concept Artist here of Cloud Imperium Games of the Los Angeles studio. Last week, we briefly talked about the light, medium, and heavy Outlaw Legacy armors. We also talked about designing around the different zones of the character pipeline, and also the different usage of materials. This week, we put the spotlight on the light, medium, and heavy Marine Legacy armors, and much, much more. So let's take a look.
So the Marines are a kind of a different challenge for us. The Outlaws are easy to redesign because we're just basically replacing them with something new. Whereas the Marines are a different challenge because we already have Marines now. Currently, you can play with light, medium, and heavy CDS Marines, and that they look great and they're super fun, but now we have these old Marines that we need to put into the game, and that's just kind of awkward. So why would we even do them at that point if we've kind of already redone them? Would be a question that you might ask.
With the old armor, a lot of the legacy assets are not made to be modular to be able to fit to our new updated male base body. So with the new Legacy Medium Marine, you can now wear it among other armor sets. So the chest piece will be able to fit with other leg armor pieces. The gauntlets and the greaves will be able to fit onto the new male body and be able to also be modular with other pieces from different armor sets.
And the reason is we want to redesign them for the fans. That's the #1 reason we want to do it. But also we found some fun lore reasons to redesign them. And so I think one of my favorite things about redoing them is that essentially we're using the term legacy or history as being historical. So the light, medium, and heavy legacy Marines are actually older models of the current Marine armor that you're playing with now. And so I think that's a fun way to build this into the lore for the players as well. It adds a lot of fun elements for gameplay as well. So maybe they could be cheaper. Maybe they could have different types of stats. You know, and also lets us play with different shape languages. The new Marines are super slick, and the old ones are a bit more chunky, a bit more different, and they start playing with different types of materials. So they're playing, you know, the new Marines are a lot about lots of metal, lots of coverage and that kind of stuff, really high tech. And the older Marines have lots of different types of fabrics in them. So maybe there's more leathers or things that look like padded leathers, more synthetics and fabrics. And just as they've advanced their technology, they've also enhanced their look. One of the biggest differences of working on the Outlaws versus the Marine stuff is that the Marine stuff is really all from one group, right? They're the Marines. One of the things that we've done differently with the Marines as well is we haven't necessarily started from a concept painting. A lot of the time concept art starts from a 2D painting or even a 3D sculpt, a concept sculpt you might call it, and you kind of go from there. With the Legacy Marines, we already have a look for the future, and we already had a look for what they looked like.
The only guideline I had was something that already existed that we couldn't just reuse because it had to be changed. So the challenge with that was kind of becoming a concept artist on the fly as I was creating the assets. So working with Jeremiah a lot back and forth, we kind of slowly built up the style of what the new Legacy Medium Marine armor would be from what we had to look at, which was the in-game model of the Medium Marine asset. We had to just concept it in 3D as we're building the asset. So that could take a lot more time because when you're going off a concept, you have a one-to-one a reference of what you need to build. But with having an old piece of art, you have to kind of reimagine what that piece is going to look like. So the process was, for me, is to first pull in what assets we have for the old medium legacy armor, kind of referencing where they were trying to go with it, what I can kind of retain in the new design. And then from taking that design, I just kind of throw in the new mill base and start kind of like shifting things around, make sure the shape language kind of reads from head to toe. With the new armor, the new Legacy Medium Marine armor, we kind of designed it so that the piece kind of reads with your eye, looking at the top of the character and reading all the way down. A lot of the designs with the older Medium Marine had a lot of horizontal and vertical lines going through it, which kind of dictates your eye if it's going down vertically. But once you hit a horizontal design, that kind of stops the flow of the design of the armor. So with the new asset, it kind of reads better with the whole flow of the armor and the design going through the whole body. So the design's more of a one look through rather than kind of looking at different areas. So with modularity, you have to think about the zones and where armor starts and where it begins. There's certain regions of the shoulder that come up that we can't have the armor come up too much because we get penetration between assets like armor plates around the bicep, the gauntlets around the arms coming up. And especially with modularity, you have to keep your armor sets into different zones to kind of be able to mix and match different sets without having to worry too much about spacing. So as long as you stick with these zones of the armor, you don't really have to worry too much about clipping and then other armor sets being non-modular with other pieces. Well, you can't get too carried away with your designs when modularity comes into play. It definitely restricts you to certain design choices, especially when all of our armor sets fit a suit of armor. We have to be able to mix and match any piece of armor onto one male body. So our undersuit is relatively tight because it has to fit the form of the male body. And then all the armor on top of that has to also feel flush and sequenced with what you're wearing underneath, which is the bodysuit. So a lot of our armor is fairly form-fitting. So our jumpsuits kind of fit tightly so that armor can go on top of it. But with our culling system, any major pieces of armor that's for the chest will cull out objects underneath it. So if it may penetrate, our system will call out that piece of geometry underneath so that you won't see it if it is clipping. So it takes away a lot of the work that has to go into maybe adjusting volumes or positions of gear so that they don't clip through and penetrate, so you see that in the game. So.
Again, we didn't do any concept paintings for this, so I don't have anything of that to show you. But we're fortunate enough now that this is already in-game. We've shown you this in some sneak peeks and I think some studio updates. But this is actually currently being rigged. So super excited to show you a basically in-game and almost ready to get to you guys as soon as possible version of this. One of the things that we really liked about doing these just in 3D and kind of experimenting with those shapes as they're in production is that we were able to pull open the old models and really reference them a lot to say, we want to focus on some of the same design lines or elements or shapes, while also being able to say, what were the weaker points, what were the not as strong points in this design, and kind of try to up those as much as possible. It does extend the production time for high poly because you are exploring shapes, you're not necessarily shooting for a specific target. But in the end, you can also find some stuff that's more fun because you're able to see what works and see what doesn't work and kind of edit on the fly that way. Once we finished high poly, we moved into the game asset phase. As we've been doing more armors and we're really understanding, really being able to refine our rigging phases, we've learned that some of the armor needs additional cuts to make it look good when it animates. Something that we've started to do on some of our recent armors, like some of the heavy slaver armors or the heavy marine armors, where we actually separate out individual panels on the armor itself. Typically, what you would see in a game mesh is something that would be like one solid mesh. And the issue is when that starts moving around and is animated, it looks like it's rubbery or it looks like it's stretching. And that's like a real quick call out to say like this is a game asset. It doesn't look super highly refined. It's not very filmic. And so something that the rigging team was able to help us out with was saying, if you guys cut, if you have a design and it's got a chest piece and maybe shoulder pieces, but the chest piece looks like it could break apart from movement, break those pieces apart. And then when they're rigging it, they're actually able to move those pieces independently than it is the central piece. And that makes it look, just like a knight's armor or, other high-tech armor, that those pieces are actually moving and skinned and weighted independently, and that makes it look more high quality than it would if it was a single contiguous mesh. We've seen a lot of improvements in our techniques using the layer blend. The layer blend is a shader that allows us to combine all of our draw calls on a single material down to one draw call. There are times that it does go higher if you're adding glows or different special effects to that, but the impressive part about using the layer blend is you can try to get as much variation you want in the asset itself, and really the savings are always going to be the same for a very simple asset to a very, very complicated asset. As long as it has one layer blend material applied to it, it's very, very cost effective. Because the shader is so cost effective, we've found that we can create a lot of different submaterials and put a lot of different submaterials on a single material. And what we're doing now, we've shown this in previous shader discussions, one that me and Forrest had, but where you were able to zoom in to like almost a micro level and see the fabric or see the you can really zoom in and get a full read on the material at any distance. One of the things that we're able to do now with that is by layering up submaterials and actually putting on several different layers of a single submaterial in one area, we're able to get variation. That sounds a little complicated, but basically what it means is if you look at a picture, any Google any picture, any JPEG picture, and zoom into it, it gets really pixelated. That's a traditional diffuse map. If you zoom into a diffuse map, it just gets pixelated, right? With ours, we're using small diffuse maps that tile across a whole mesh. And what that does is it makes it really easy so that when you zoom in, there's no breakup in the material and it holds up at a micro level. The problem with that is that you're only using a single material with no color variation. Now if you look at anything that, if you look at your jeans right now, a lot of people are probably wearing blue jeans. I'm wearing jeans. There's a lot of different colors in your jeans. There's a lot of different colors in your shirts. There's a lot of different colors in everything, and people don't really notice that. So when you're, if I'm looking at my jeans right now, I have like a dark blue. There's even little elements of yellows and greens and whites in that. And the way that we've found for the layer blend material to get that variation is actually by layering the same material on it with a slight breakup in the blend map, which separates the type of maps, the type of materials that we're using, with a slightly different color. And so we're able to essentially generate a new diffuse map. It's not really a diffuse map, but we're getting the variation that a diffuse map would have just by layering lots of different materials in the same color on it. And so right now the medium marine is in rigging. Typically a mesh will go to rigging and then they'll spend some time skinning it up and then we'll get feedback. So one of the things that we're working on now is actually cutting up some of the plates that I talked about to figure out where we really want to get more of that motion in the character. Typical problem areas for us are in the shoulders. You have a lot of movement in the shoulders, especially for our game. Anytime when the shoulders go all the way down to all the way up, you have a lot of movement there, both forward and back. So definitely in the shoulders is one area. The other area is always going to be the hips and waist. So there's a lot of torsion and rotation in the waist, and that's one area where you can typically see a lot of stretching in a character, which is something that we try to avoid. So we're going to try to do some changes actually to what you're going to see now to make sure that some of these plates here feel a little bit more layered on top of each other, a little more stacked, and just a little more mobile. The light marine is also in high poly phase right now. We're focusing on kind of updating the shapes as we go through production, just while we're working on high poly. We're not doing a concept painting for this either. The fun thing about it is we get to explore what kind of works and just kind of play around with it and just kind of really get to experiment with it. But I think it's starting to come along pretty well. It has some pretty iconic elements. One of my favorite thing about the light marine is how asymmetrical it is. So, you know, a lot of our standard suits are kind of, you know, split down the middle. Right side looks like the left side, whereas the light had a lot of kind of tubes and things coming cross body, which is a fun element to be able to play in with. So, super excited to see how this one goes for the rest of production.
In concepting costumes, we would add cloth and different kinds of materials together to make things look more real. In real life, you don't see, well, if you look at current armor today, you don't see someone wearing just metal plates all over their body. There's Kevlar, there's also some sorts of metal, plastics, sometimes leather, cloth, a bunch of materials are put together. So having multiple materials in a balanced way, in a very, and also placed strategically will make the asset or make the costume look more realistic. That has kind of become the trend of concept and also design in fashion and also just armor in general. And so a lot of our previous assets didn't have a lot of those material variants. A lot of them were just color variants. So we might have a stripe instead of an actual material variant. So what we've been doing recently was introduce lots of different kinds of materials, lots of different shapes, and fabric happened to be one of them. A great example is the Sand Nomad, when we introduced the waving cloth. It really gave a different type of look and feel and more realistic compared to the older characters we had. So we wanted to give the legacy armors that treatment as well, and not stick out like a sore thumb compared to our newer character assets.
The Heavy Marine is also in high poly, but we actually did do a concept painting for this one. The Heavy Marine, I think, is probably one of my favorite armors of the old one because it has some really distinct shapes. Part of the reason we wanted to do a painting on this one is because the heavy armors, just by being what they are heavy, I mean, they have more stuff on them. So to kind of wing those on the fly is not as easy as it is to do a light or a medium where there's less actual elements on the character. So when you get to something that's really complicated and has a lot of pieces on it, having a painting to kind of at least sort out some of those simple lines for you is really easy to follow.
I took a look at the previous asset that we've had and also the current Marine that we have. And there was a drastic difference in shapes, also the size, and also our old legacy armor looked really low tech compared to our current one. And so we wanted to show like, oh, there is growth and time, but it almost felt too far away in time. It almost looked like something that would have been created actually in the Star Citizen or maybe 600 years ago, possibly. So we wanted to kind of cut that down also and introduce the multiple materials that I spoke earlier about on the Heavy Marine. So I maintained the original silhouette actually and the shape of the original Heavy Marine. So I would keep the big shoulder pads and also the big chest plate that the Heavy Marine had. I just added a lot more layering on top of the armor to make it look more integrated with each other than rather just blocks. And so, but the overall shapes of the Heavy Marine, the previous Heavy Marine, are actually very similar to the new one that we're making. Also the helmet as well, I didn't change the helmet as much. I tried to keep a lot of the shapes, but then some of the shapes on the helmet were a little too simple. It was literally just, I think, just a plane here and a plane in the back. And I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting, more integrated with each other. I think that was the key word actually when I was designing the Heavy Marine, integration. So a lot of the shapes go into each other and come out and layer on top. And so there is this flow to this design where the eye can go down and you see things kind of interlocking with each other rather than just box, and bigger box, and a box. So I actually introduced a lot more fabrics, a lot more rubber, along with the hard pieces as well. But I did take into consideration of the original aesthetic of the Heavy Marine. I added more lines that would make it more streamlined, rather than those big squares that you have on the shoulders. And I think it had like belts all around. So I took a lot of the shapes from the Heavy Marine because I didn't want to completely change the design. I wanted to update it, bring it up to the same standard, and also the biggest thing of today, zones. It didn't respect any of the zones. And so we had to tweak it anyway, so we're like, why don't we just upgrade the asset. When approaching the different sizes for our characters, especially from a light to a heavy, the silhouette is a big thing. And I have to be in a certain mindset to design a certain size. Something that's more on the light side, we'll try to keep it skin tight. And so I would have to play along. I would have to play inside pretty much the base mail to a certain extent, and maybe some slight, like a vest or maybe a torso and some light pieces. But when it comes to the heavy, I'll admit it, compared to a lot of games, our heavy are heavy. They're huge. And so I remember originally, back in the day, when we did the Heavy Marine, we couldn't find the right size for the Heavy Marine. And then it went through multiple iterations, and we found the size that we all liked, and it happened to be this gargantuan thing. And so we can't just put random stuff on the Heavy and just call it a day. We have to make sure that it makes sense or aesthetically look like it'll make sense. So there's a different mindset that I have to go through. The light, honestly, is easier for me because it's just literally just paint on top of the base mail or an undersuit and just add some small bits here and there, make sure the lines on the character follow and flow. But the Heavy Marine or the heavy assets take a little bit of time because also we don't want the heavy armors to look exactly the same to each other. And so a good example would be the Slaver armor. The Slaver heavy armor, very similar to the CDS armor, but yet they're different. And so trying to find an aesthetic that differentiates different manufacturers but maintain the same size is a little rough. So it takes some time and thought to get to actually execute. Because of modularity, I know there will be a player that will put on a Heavy Marine chest, a light outlaw arms, and maybe some Shubin boots and an RSI helmet, and it will look absolutely ridiculous, right? And so if I try to cater towards that direction, I feel like all our designs will look stale because I would have to use the same lines for every single asset. And so there is a certain limitation on the creativity side if I were to just stick with that in mind. So there are times when I'm like, you know what, we really want to get this asset in, and that asset will always look best with a certain group and class of that specific model and the other parts that go with it. So I would prioritize towards that set first. And if it looks good on that asset, I might rethink it a little bit for the other assets, but I don't let modularity stop me, actually. I think.
So as you can see, we're making really good progress on all the legacy armors. They aren't planned for 3.0, but we are shooting for a release soon after that. We're hoping to get them to you as soon as possible.
All of these upgrades to the Outlaw and Marine armor mean that you'll soon be able to mix and match modular pieces to create a suit of armor that not only looks good, but matches your playstyle.
Very cool, and that's all for today's show. Thanks to our subscribers for helping us produce all the video content that keeps the community up to date on Star Citizen.
And of course, thanks to all of our backers for your incredible support over the years. This game is only possible because of you.
That is true. Finally, remember to tune in to the Star Citizen Twitch channel tomorrow, starting at 12:30 UTC to catch everything happening at CitizenCon.
And be sure to check out the event schedule on the website, so whether you'll be joining us in Frankfurt or streaming it online, you can plan your day accordingly.
Lots to do, and until next week, we will see you around the verse.
thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.